The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. As we continue through this morning, dear God, we are your people. We are gathered in the name and in the Spirit of Christ. And we pray that your Spirit flow and that you will bless us in this time in one way or another. We offer it to you, and we are thankful that we can be here together in your Spirit with Christ. Amen.
Amen.
I appreciate you all being here. I hope that you can hear me. I have two microphones on, neither of which work on these speakers. But if you can't hear me or something, just please raise your hand and let me know. I'll make sure I try to project. I don't really need to tell you how big a deal abortion is in our culture at this current time. It's an important moral issue, and it seemed like it was something that we should spend a little bit of time on. But I want to be really clear. We're not talking about Roe v. Wade. We're not talking about Dobbs. We're not going to talk about the Supreme Court. And we're certainly not going to talk about the politics involved with abortion. What I would like to do as a community of faith is spend some time this week and next week looking at some of the issues the church has historically thought through and dealt with as it is tried to understand and minister to people in the midst of abortion. And before I say anything else, I imagine that in this room right now there are a wide variety of opinions, some of them probably strongly held, and there may be women here who have had an abortion. And I want to be super sensitive about that. And I don't think I need to say it with this group, but I'm going to say it anyway. This needs to be a safe place. So that at the end, if there are comments people have or questions, everyone needs to be heard, everyone needs to be respected, everyone needs to be loved. I don't anticipate it will be a problem. But you know what I want to avoid is that. And there's too much of that. There's a lot of screaming, and there's too little listening when it comes to this issue. And yes, I know how viscerally people feel about it. I get that. I have my thoughts and feelings as well. But it really is crucial that we, as the body of Christ, don't imitate that. My agenda, I'll be very upfront. I'm not here to proselytize for any particular position. I'm not going to try to convince you to believe one thing or another about abortion. What I want to do is convey, one, the complexity of this issue, as it has been for the church down through these many centuries. And to emphasize to you, there are a variety of Christian responses. There have always been a variety of Christian responses. And despite what the popular press often tries to convey, that there's one Christian way of dealing with abortion, that is factually untrue. So I want to spend time looking at that. All I can do is give an overview, because of course you could talk weeks and weeks and weeks about all these issues. But at least to give you some food for thought. And I say the church has dealt with this. It has from the beginning. The Bible does not mention abortion, but we know abortion was practiced in the ancient world, often with gruesome and tragic results, because the problem of unwanted pregnancies has been with us for ages. The early church dealt with it. The medieval church dealt with it. We continue to deal with it. So there is a long tradition of discourse and thought around this. And I will try to at least touch on the key things and sort of give you a broad picture. And the way I want to divide it up, and any division is somewhat artificial because there's overlapping themes here. This week I want to talk about the personhood of an embryo, and next week about the autonomy of women. And it's sort of an artificial distinction in terms of topic because they will flow. But you have to divide it up somehow, and that's the way we're going to do it. The personhood of an embryo. It raises a fundamental question: what is a human being? And of course, that's a question that's deep, and it has many dimensions. It's a philosophical question, it's a metaphysical question, it's a legal question, it's a psychological question, but it's also a theological one. What is it in the Judeo-Christian tradition that we believe makes us a human being? Well, there's pretty much a universal agreement, if you look down through the centuries of the church, that what makes us human is that we are made in the image of God, and that being made in the image of God means that we have a soul. Now, the nature of that soul has been hard to define. Just like spirit is hard to define. Just like consciousness is hard to define. And there have been many different ways of thinking about it and treating it. But as I say, there's just been near universal agreement that if you're a human being, you are an embodied person with a soul. And that without a soul, you would not be a full human being. That, of course, leads to the next obvious question. When do we become an ensouled person? And this is where the church begins to have a variety of different opinions. Now, early on in the church, there were a group of people, the technical term they used was traducianists. And what they did is they believed that when a human being is created in the womb, it is created with a body and a soul, because they believe that the parents create the soul, that the parents pass on the soul and the body to the child. Well, actually, generally speaking, people believe that the woman was a passive receptacle and the male implanted seed, and the seed contained a body and a soul. The most outspoken person in the early church in the West for this was a man named Tertullian, who insisted that we have to see the soul as being present from the very beginning. The soul also begins from conception, Tertullian says. If that's true, if in fact within the womb of a woman is a being with a body and a soul, that means it's a full human being, which led Tertullian to the, in his mind, inescapable conclusion. It makes no difference whether one destroys a soul already born or interferes with its coming to birth. It is a human being, and one was a man, for the whole fruit is present in the seed. Tertullian and the other traducianists believed that abortion was wrong, because from the moment of conception, there was a body and there was a soul, and as long as there is a soul there, it's a human person and needs to be treated as such. Now, he was a Western writer. There were writers in the East who got to a similar place that he did, but through a different path. Eastern writers, and then actually most Christian writers, have been very uncomfortable with the idea that parents create a soul. In their mind, only God creates a soul. So some, like Origen, believe that we pre-exist, that all of us have a pre-existence as souls before we're born. Others, like a man named Basil of Caesarea, believe that in the moment of conception, God infuses a soul. But, like Tertullian, they did believe that once you're conceived, your body, your soul, you're a full person. And therefore, abortion was wrong. Now, that was one view in the early church. Tertullian was really adamant about the view. Why? Because it's not the only view. In fact, it's not even the dominant view. And to get at the dominant view, we need to look at a passage from Scripture that is probably unfamiliar to you. It's not one that we read on Sunday mornings. It's from Exodus 21. It's the closest we come to dealing with this issue in the Bible. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, strike for strike. Now that's a striking thing. It raises disturbing thoughts. Why are pregnant women getting attacked and all these things? But what is noteworthy about the passage, and the rabbis commented on it, it's in the Talmud, it's sort of well established in the interpretation. In Hebrew scripture, the punishment for murder is always death. Always. If somebody makes a woman miscarriage, he does not die, because what is being miscarried is not considered a person. It is not considered an act of murder. So he just has to pay a fine. If any harm follows, seems to apply to the mother. So, pregnant woman is attacked. She miscarries. That's an offense. Pay a fine for it. If the pregnant woman dies, that's murder. Life for life. The man will die. The woman is a person. And all the laws about retribution that apply in the Old Testament apply to her. They do not apply to what the woman carries in the womb. Now this is the NRSV translation from something called the Masoretic Text. And I won't get into all the weeds about biblical translations. But this text was formalized around between the years 800 and 1000 after Jesus. In biblical terms, it's rather late. At the time of Jesus, this would not have been the text that would have been read. What was read in the Hellenistic world and in the early church was a Greek translation of the Bible called the Septuagint, which was produced 200 or 300 years before Jesus. And it has a slightly different translation for this. It says, "And if two men strive and smite a woman, and her child be born imperfectly formed, he shall be forced to pay a penalty, as the woman's husband may lay upon him, he shall pay with a valuation. But if it be perfectly formed, he shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, etc." So, this is interesting. So, both of these passages would say that at least early on in a pregnancy, if the pregnancy is lost, a person has not died. There's no murder committed. But while this passage seems to talk about the mother, then this talks about a perfectly formed child. Both of these are about miscarriage. So if you have a miscarriage of something imperfectly formed, it's not a person. If you have a miscarriage or a stillbirth of something perfectly born, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. It is a person and it is murder. So this is interesting because the term formed is really important. It will actually dominate the discussion of this issue for almost 2,000 years. The distinction between an unformed and a formed embryo, an unformed and a formed fetus. What is the distinction? How do you draw that distinction? But it was an important one. The Hebrew Bible doesn't talk much about it. We only get hints, like in Psalm 139. "For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance." It's poetry. We're not exactly sure how much that says about the Hebrew idea about life in the womb. But whereas we may not know a lot about the Israelites, we know a lot about the Greeks. And for the Greeks, that was absolutely accepted conventional wisdom that there is an unformed and there is a formed fetus. And a lot of that has to do with this man, Aristotle. Like Plato, Aristotle believed that you had to have a soul to be a human being. He had a sort of different idea of soul than Plato had. But Aristotle was convinced that a newly conceived embryo cannot have a soul, by definition. And so Aristotle said that the ensoulment doesn't take place until 40 days if you're a male, 90 days if you're a female. I'm not defending Aristotle, I'm just saying. But this becomes just part of the culture. Aristotle's not the only one who believes this. Early on, and we could get into, the Greek culture has all sorts of ideas about infancy and all sorts of things, and we just don't have the time to go into all of them. But what matters for us is that this viewpoint was largely accepted in the early church. This idea that when you're first pregnant, you have an unformed child, and then at some point it becomes a formed child. And if it's an unformed child, abortion's not a problem. If it's a formed child with a soul, abortion is a problem. And so when you do get statements about abortion in the early church, that sense of form and soul are always there. For example, something called the Apostolic Constitutions, late 4th century from Syria. "You should not slay your child by causing an abortion, nor kill that which is begotten. For everything that is shaped and has received a soul from God, if it be slain, shall be avenged as being unjustly destroyed." So it's got to be shaped, it's got to have a soul. So, of course, you're thinking, as you should be thinking, all right, when does that happen? At what point do you say, okay, it's fully formed? At what point do you say it has a soul? And there was a lot of discussion about this in the church. Augustine, one of the two greatest and most influential theologians in the Western church, tackled it head on. He looked at Exodus 21, and he agreed. The fact that the author did not want the unborn childbirth to belong to the homicide proves that he thought it was not a man that is carried in the mother's womb. So Augustine agreed with the general culture that early on in a pregnancy, it is not a person. But then he tried to figure out, well, when does it become a person? And he spent time, he struggled, and this is where he arrived. A question may be most carefully discussed by the most learned men, and still, I do not know that any man can answer it. Namely, when does a human being begin to live in the womb? In other words, we don't know. And some would say that's a rare act of intellectual humility on Augustine's part, but we do not know, was his point. And there is no way, he said, to determine it. He was convinced that a newly conceived embryo could not be an ensouled person, but he didn't know how you go about then deciding when it is. Now, I said Augustine was one of the two greatest, most influential theologians of the Western Church. The other one is Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas also was convinced that a newly conceived fetus, embryo, cannot be an ensouled person by definition. But unlike Augustine, he did think there was a time when it does become ensouled. And for Aquinas, that took place at what they called quickening, which is when a mother first feels the child move in the womb, which is, I gather, on average between 13 and 16 weeks. And there are reasons why Aquinas believed that. We don't need to go into it. But he did. And he believed that before that, the embryo, the fetus, was not a person and not protected by any rules against abortion. He was not an outlier. He basically gave voice to what was the common wisdom of the time. He is not a murderer who brings about abortion before the soul is in the body, from Pope Gregory VI. No human intellect accepts the view that an infant has a rational soul from the moment of conception. It was considered impossible. You could think of it. Peter Spain wrote something called The Treasury of the Poor. Interesting book. It has lots of remedies in it. It has herbs and it has medications that people take, a variety of things, including a number that could be used to force miscarriage, induce an abortion. And he laid them out, told them how to do it. He was encouraged. What is significant is that Peter of Spain becomes Pope John the 21st in 1276. It is not homicide to kill an embryo less than 40 days old because it is not yet human. Pope Gregory XIII. And then in 1621, the Vatican issued a pastoral directive permission abortion for up to 40 days. So, for centuries, there was this idea that there's an unformed and a formed fetus. While it's unformed, abortion is permitted. It's acceptable. But when it reaches the point of being formed and having a soul, that changes. This whole thing starts to go away in the year 1869. Under Pius IX, the Roman Code of Canon Law changes. And it eliminates the distinction between unformed and formed fetuses and pushes back the ban against abortion to the moment of conception. Now, I'm talking about the Roman Catholic Church a lot because it's the largest church. And it has had historically and continues to have a huge influence on theological public debate about abortion. So what goes on in that church affects all of us. So the Roman Catholic Church gets rid of that distinction, starts to ban abortion. But it does so with a nuanced ethical stance. And this is important because it's often missed out on. The official stance of the Roman Catholic Church is called probabilism. Probabilism says, we don't know when somebody becomes human. Augustine is right, can't determine it. Conception, when the central nervous system is formed, day 23. Detectable heartbeat at the 6th week. When it goes from being an embryo to being a fetus around week 9. When the mother first feels movements, 3rd or 4th month. When it draws its first breath. We can't say. But because we can't say, we know that at every stage along the way there's a likelihood that it is a person. And because there is some degree of possibility or likelihood it is a person, it should always be treated as a person. That is the official stance. It doesn't come out in canon law. What it comes out is papal encyclicals. So, for example, in Dono Vitae, the magisterium has not expressly committed itself to an affirmation of a philosophical nature about when life begins. But it constantly reaffirms the moral condemnation of any kind of procured abortion. We don't know when it becomes an ensouled person, but we will continue to reject all abortion. The Evangelium Vitae in the 90s lays out the probabilistic position from the standpoint of moral obligation. The mere probability that a human person is involved would suffice to justify an absolutely clear prohibition of any intervention aimed at killing a human embryo. So that is the official Roman Catholic stance. Now there are strengths to that stance, and there are some critiques of it coming from within the Roman Church itself. We're going to touch on 1 or 2 of those next week. But when we hear from the Roman Catholic Church, this is officially at least where it's coming from. But that is not the only pro-life position out there. The other really dominant one is, well, philosophically called substantialism. You won't see that word a lot in popular discourse or the websites you can go to, but this is sort of what evangelical commentators and theologians would be subscribing to. And basically what it says is that I am in substance the same person I was when I was in my mother's womb. That there is a direct continuity. I have the same DNA. I have essentially the same substance. If there's any difference, it's a difference of degree, not a difference of kind. Substantialism believes that in the womb, at the moment of conception, when the sperm fertilizes an egg, you are a whole person. In substance, what you are going to be the rest of your life. Changing, evolving, sure, but of the same basic essence. As I say, evangelical theologians tend to embrace this more than Roman Catholics. That idea that from the moment of conception, it's a human being with a soul and cannot ever be aborted is often thought to be the Christian position. But it is not the only Christian position. There are, in fact, many people writing opposed to that. There is quite a strong pro-choice critique of substantialism. And the critique has many different levels. One is simply biblical, because it's not biblical. You can't justify that from the Bible. 2, historical. That's not been historically the undivided mind of the church. It is the different take. There have been people who have believed it, but there have been plenty who have not. And then in recent years, a lot of theologians have just looked at basic medical science. Part of the appeal of substantialism is that it's simple. It begins with an event. Life begins with an event. A sperm fertilizes an egg. But of course we know medically that conception is actually more of a process. Eggs fertilize, becomes a zygote, makes its way down through the fallopian tube, keeps multiplying, becomes a blastocyst. Eventually the blastocyst will implant itself on the uterine wall. The process can take anywhere from 6 to 14 days. And we also know it's a process with a high rate of failure. Current research indicates or predicts that between 50 and 70% of fertilized eggs never make it to implantation. They just pass from the woman's body without ever becoming attached to the wall. And if they do become implanted, of course we all know that's not a guarantee for success. In this country, approximately 1 in 5 known pregnancies ends in a miscarriage, which is upwards of 1 million a year. So, that, of course, is a human concern. It's a pastoral concern. Miscarriages are a source of a lot of pain and grief. I acknowledge that. I want to set that aside for a moment because it is a theological issue as well. Because if we believe that the moment an egg is fertilized by a serpent, that's a full person with a soul, then we are saying that many, if not most, human persons are never born. And that is a theologically problematic statement. And we can assert it, but we're doing so deliberately saying that most persons with souls are never born. Would God do that? Is that really what we are believing? And then the problems continue because there's the issue of twinning. I mean, not an issue when it's fraternal twins, two separate eggs fertilized, but if you have a monozygotic twin, it begins from one zygote, and you're saying that's a person with a soul, what does it mean to say that it splits? Can a soul split? Can a person split? Does that make sense? And actually, very, very early on, the cells in a zygote are what they call totipotentiary cells. They can become anything. They can become an embryo. They can split and twin. They can become part of the placenta. They've not expressed themselves. They are undifferentiated. So, theologians and philosophers ask, does it make sense to identify that is a person when the cells themselves have not decided that? It raises problems. And then there's chimerism, which is quite rare, but it does happen. And that's where you have two fertilized eggs that join. Intersexual people with male and female body parts often are a result of chimerism. And sometimes there's not a physical manifestation at all, but there are people who have two complete genomes in their bodies. Are they one person? Are they two persons? Do they have one soul? Do they have two souls? All these are part of a critique of substantialism that says it seems easy and simple to say, once the egg is fertilized, no problems, we know what we're talking about. You can argue that, well, maybe we don't fully know what we're talking about. All this in recent decades has led a lot of theologians and writers on this issue to take a step back from the whole history of discussing abortion and say, maybe this focus on personhood is not the right approach. Because we keep agonizing over when that embryo is a person or when that fetus is a person, and we can't really determine that, and maybe that's just not a helpful way of looking at it. And these writers will say that pregnancy is sui generis. It is unique in the human condition. And because of that, this being that is so completely intertwined physically with the life of the mother, dependent on the life of the mother, it doesn't make sense to talk about it as a person. And yet, that doesn't mean it doesn't have value. Because, the lived experience, I'm a man, I've never been pregnant. So all I can do is respectfully listen to what women say and write. But many of the women I read write obviously as women and as mothers. And there's a lot of research and studies about how women feel about pregnancy. And it ranges, from women who see, their embryo as an adversary, a foreign invader, all the way to deep, deep bonding with them from the earliest days. But what these theologians say is, there's a strong sense that women intuitively understand that what they carry has value. But where does that leave us? So, people like Margaret Kamasuka, who's a professor at Oberlin, they say this: I propose the status of a fetus is best understood in terms of intensive dual claim. A fetus is not a non-person without value, but neither is a fetus a person whom a woman is morally obligated always to gestate. Basically, the argument goes, so we need to get past the personhood debate, because that's hard to resolve, and it becomes, an impossible point of contention. What if we think about it differently? And so, in recent years, there's been more of this kind of thing, like let's change the terms of the debate. Let's shift the paradigm and see if that helps us out. So, just a couple things. Thank you for your patience. I want to convey to you, number one, there have been faithful, committed, believing Christians for 2,000 years who have believed that from the moment of conception, what a woman carries is a full human being with a soul, and that abortion is wrong. And there have been faithful, committed, practicing Christians for 2,000 years who have believed that's not true. That early on in a pregnancy, that is not a person with a soul, that there is a window for abortion, and that can be a morally justified decision. Both of those viewpoints are Christian viewpoints that have been held by people in the church. The second thing I want to say, which should probably be very obvious to you by this point, is that this discussion is really missing something crucial, and that's the pregnant woman herself. Because equally important to establishing, what is the personhood of the embryo, equally important is the pregnant woman, her needs, her desires, her reality. And so there needs to be, and there has been, discussion about the physical, spiritual, the emotional autonomy of women and their ability to make moral decisions with their own bodies, and how do we then sort of weigh that in with some of the things we've been talking about today, and that is what we're going to be talking about next week. Again, giving an overview of some of the issues that will be discussed. So I'm aware that, we've only seen part of the picture, and the experience of women who are pregnant is an equally important part of that. So thank you for listening. I'm going to stop. I don't know if people have comments or questions, but they're certainly free to do so now. Yes?
Back in the first of your talk, you talked about Tertullian. Was he Roman? You said he was Western.
Yeah, he's an African, but yeah, he wrote in Latin. He was a Western, not an Eastern. Western thinker. Let's say African Western, like Augustine was an African. Yes?
Does the Episcopal Church have a position?
Yeah, so I'm going to share that with you next week. Yes, we do. I'm not trying to be coy. It's just it's a statement, and I'm going to show it, and it's starting to show up. Abortion is serious, but the Episcopal Church supports free choice. Support choice. Yes.
What is your thought about the Jeremiah who says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you"?
Yeah, so that's the call of prophets comes up in these discussions, and that's one of them. And when it is discussed, generally the exegesis of passages like that seem to be unhelpful in terms of the nature of fetal life, because what those passages are focusing on is God's foreknowledge in God's call. So you could say that God called Jeremiah from before Jeremiah was born, or while Jeremiah was being formed. But we're not really sure what to do with that in terms of, does that say really much about how the Israelites viewed life in the womb? It's really a statement about God and Jeremiah's call. So generally speaking, even pro-life people have found that to be not a helpful passage, because it's not really dealing with the nature of fetal life. Yes?
This might be taking things too literally, but early on in the presentation when you were presented some statements about unperfectly formed babies versus perfectly formed. Does that have anything, is there any involvement there in the thinking about a baby that comes out imperfectly and has been fully gestated, but as happens, is not perfectly formed?
That's a great question. It seems like, sort of the Talmudic interpretation in Exodus 21 is just dealing with miscarriage. The whole history of how the church has dealt with handicaps, disabilities is not a pretty history. And in the Greco-Roman world, it wasn't pretty because they often exposed infants that were deformed or considered, not up to the standards the parents wanted. So it's not a happy history. But that would be a whole other discussion. But I think that particular passage, the way that the tradition says it's about miscarriage. But you raise a really good question. How do we treat children who are somehow we perceive as being handicapped or defective? Yes?
What about the position of other large religions, Islam, Hindu? Do you know offhand?
I don't.
I think Islam is like 4 months.
Is that what it is?
4 months after birth.
Okay, thank you.
I think that the Jews believe in abortion because I think there's actually a suit going on maybe somewhere where they've outlawed all abortion, and it may be Florida. I don't know, but there's an active Jewish community that's bringing suit because they're saying you're imposing on my religion by not allowing me to have an abortion.
I do know that there is debate. The Orthodox tradition, the Lubavitcher, for example, they're opposed to abortion. But I know the Reformed tradition supports it. But I don't know all the details of that, discussion. Yes, Chris?
There's also the concept of spirit, and spirit in Greek means breath, and the idea is the breath of life came in when you were born and exited when you died. And what is the implication towards abortion with that concept of timing?
Yeah, so as you may be aware, the Stoics believed you're not a person until you took your first breath. And there is a rabbinic tradition that says you're not a person until you take your first breath as well. I don't know if it's the dominant view of Judaism, but it's there because breath is such an important image in the Bible. God breathes life into Adam. And as I said, there were non-believers, Stoics, and others in the ancient world who thought breath was essential. So it's a good point, and it's there. It's there in the tradition, certainly. Linda.
Has there been any historical foundation for other Protestant churches who have taken stands, or has it gone back for many generations, or is it prominent? But other than Episcopalian and Catholic, but our major Western Protestant dominations, do they take stands, and has it been historical?
I don't know, but I'm sure they do. I find it impossible to think that they didn't, but I don't know the details of those. I'm guessing they have. They certainly have with sexuality issues, so I can't imagine they have not with abortion. Yes?
I just am thinking about that part with the probability doctrines and thinking how then do you start to draw the line with any kind of contraception?
We're going to talk about that next week because there are all sorts of reasons to be against abortion that are not pro-life. And we're going to see that historically the church has had a real problem. And that touches on one of the problems we've had. We're going to talk about that next week. Yes?
This may also touch into future discussion. I'm wondering about the science of conception. So if you freeze your embryos, or if you kind of freeze the birth, and you use 1 or 2 or whatever it is, you have your child and the others are disposed of. Is that
Well, you know that. Well, it is an issue for people. I mean, there are critics of that practice, as there are those who support it. It does come up.
But is it part of the I think it was, I'm forgetting the terms, but I think it was substantialism. Is it kind
Well,
of that?
if you believe that a fertilized egg is a person with a soul, then yes, that frozen embryo, a frozen zygote, whatever, would be a person. Yes?
So I'm going to extend a little bit your comment on chimerism.
Okay.
And that there's been more research since you've probably done this that basically every woman who's had a child contains a small portion of that child's cells.
Oh.
So if you believe the cells contain a soul, basically, each woman has the soul of all their children, including stillbirth children, or every pregnancy, not just ones that were delivered alive.
Thank you for
It's a
sharing.
very small portion of cells, but it's actually why women get more autoimmune diseases, because they actually have immune reactions against some of those cells.
Thank you. Appreciate your sharing that. Bruce.
Related to Chris's comment, the key as you presented it is the soul and the body, and at death, what is the range of attitudes to what happens to the soul at death? If there is an abortion, is the soul extinguished? Does the soul
Those are great questions. Those are huge questions. We could go down lots of rabbit holes with them. Because part of the reason there was a lot of debate, discussion of this, is there's such a high rate of infant mortality, a high rate of miscarriage, especially in the ancient world. And so there was a lot of discussion about what happens. And that would be a whole other forum to go into all, because there's a wide variety of opinions about that, and the church has gone down some interesting roads that way. But we'd have to. I would take some time to lay all that out. Future talk. Dennis.
Yeah, it seems that the church has never had a particular problem with the death penalty. I mean, even with the death penalty.
Oh, yeah.
Even the passages you put up, they talk about an eye for an eye, a life for a life, etc. Yet, in the case of the death penalty, you know you're killing somebody with a soul. You know that there's a possibility that the person was wrongfully convicted. When they talk about probabilities. So I just wonder why that juxtaposition doesn't seem to have created more debate and problems.
Well, it has created debate in the Roman Catholic Church, because there are pro-life Roman Catholics who are pro-life. They call it a seamless garment. They're against abortion, they're against the death penalty, and they are for helping the poor with food aid. I mean, they are, in their mind, to be pro-life covers the whole gamut. So there are people, and they do object that the church would ever be against abortion but support the death penalty. Those voices are there. They speak out in the Roman Catholic Church, for sure. Because it's a good point. Anything else?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm curious if in the history, if God is involved in anybody's pregnancy besides the Virgin Mary, because it seems like the result they were referencing was like two men fighting might cause a miscarriage or a stillborn, and it's like always the actions of other people and humans around. Like, is God involved in any of the examples of a family or a pregnancy for women, or is it just strictly the result of the actions of people around her affecting her pregnancy?
Well, that's a good question. Thank you. There are in the Bible certainly lots of stories of infertile women who become pregnant because God intervenes. Sarah, Hannah, Elizabeth. I mean, there are a number of stories where God is definitely part of that birthing process. The Mary story is different because it says that God actually is the impregnating partner, so to speak. Whereas the others are the result of marriage and normal human relations. But God is involved in helping a woman to go from being infertile to being fertile. So there's a lot there. I'm not sure if that gets at your question.
So I was just asking, always fertility though, or is it, you said also infertility, like, does God ever cause a miscarriage or cause a woman not to miscarry? that's always the accident.
Yeah. You know, when David commits adultery with Bathsheba, they produce his child, and the child dies. I'm not sure, and I think the story would imply that it's a punishment. And that would raise all sorts of interesting things we could talk about. I'm not aware of God causing a miscarriage. There may be a story I'm not thinking of. I'm not aware of that. The story of that baby is the only one that comes closest that I can think of. For the record, I do not believe God causes miscarriages. Okay, anything else? Well, next week we're going to look at it from this different angle about women and the experience of women, and what are some of the things that we've talked about as church relating to the autonomy of women and their ability to make reproductive choices. So thank you, and blessings on the rest of your day.